In the past, I have made a number of videos about uncapped players. The 7 best active uncapped players, the best uncapped player from every one of FIFA's top 50 national teams, and so on. In fact, one of my first ever videos was about 7 of the best uncapped players of all time. Let's take a moment to admire that thumbnail. And just last week, I made a video putting together a best 11 and 23-man England squad made up exclusively of uncapped players. If you were feeling rather critical then, you could say I'd milk the topic for all it is worth. But whilst uncapped players are frequently discussed, undercapped players are all too often overlooked. So much so that I may have just invented that word, since I'm not sure I've ever heard the expression undercapped before. So today's video is a look at players who didn't win as many caps as their talent and club careers deserved. Though crucially, they must have won at least one cap so that we're not straying into uncapped territory yet again. It must be said, my shortlist for this 7 was a couple of pages long, but I've tried to pick out 7 interesting and extremely talented examples for your viewing pleasure. If you'd like to hit the like button and subscribe in recognition of my extraordinary ongoing sacrifice in order to bestow you with the best football-based content on YouTube, I would have no complaint about that. A quick apology for Getty's lack of images of some players featured, but we'll make do with what we've got. Here are 7 footballers who aren't uncapped, but ought to have won more caps given their talent. BERND SCHUSTER. In the vast majority of cases, I would say close to 90%, the lack of caps picked up by players I shortlisted for this 7 came as a consequence of them not getting picked. Either the manager or selectors preferred someone else, there was some rule which stopped them from representing their national team, or their past led selectors to look elsewhere. In the case of BERND SCHUSTER though, the maverick midfield maestro took the decision to retire from international football himself, aged only 24. Unusually among infrequently capped players, international football did actually play a key role in Schuster's career, since it was his performances at the 1980 European Championships in Italy, which Germany won, that prompted interest in Schuster from some of Europe's biggest clubs. He was just 20 years old at the time, but he won the silver ball as the tournament's second best player, and was promptly snapped up by Barcelona. Schuster went on to have a magnificent career, if often rather controversial. Not only did he leave Barcelona in a direct move to Real Madrid, he then went straight from Real to Atletico, winning trophies with all 3, and thrice making the top 3 of Ballon d'Or voting. A magnificent technician and passer of the ball, Schuster had repeated clashes with the German FA and his national team boss, but it was the backlash following his refusal to travel to a game against Albania due to the birth of his child that was the final nail in the coffin. Schuster retired from the international game in light of the conflict, with 21 caps to his name, aged only 24, and despite Franz Beckenbauer's best attempts, he never reversed his decision. Michael Carrick. Michael Carrick is the most capped player in this 7. In fact, the first 2 inclusions in this 7 are the most capped, and by some distance. Michael Carrick won 34 caps for England across the course of a 14-year international career, and I must admit that part of the incentive for including him was so that I had a recognisable face on the thumbnail, since without that, only the 40 to 50,000 hardcore HITC Sevens aficionados tend to tune in. Nonetheless, I do think Carrick was hard done by to only have won 34 caps, and we all know why that was the case, or all of us who are English and lived through that era of the national team do at least. For years, England persevered with a flat 4 in midfield, where Frank Lampard, Steven Gerrard and Paul Scholes struggled to really flourish. Michael Carrick was one solution, along with Owen Hargreaves, to play in that slightly deeper role and give those other, more celebrated names a touch more freedom. Lest we forget, Pep Guardiola felt Carrick was as good as Xabi Alonso and Sergio Busquets, and Alex Ferguson once called him the best player in England. English footballers never really appreciated holding players though, preferring the all-action style of someone like a Steven Gerrard. If he were playing now, in his prime, I suspect Carrick would be one of the first names on Gareth Southgate's team sheet, yet he won fewer caps than Eric Dyer. John Henson. Taking a rather large step back in time, you know I only do that when it is absolutely justified, and in this case, it most assuredly is so. John Henson is one of the greatest Nordic footballers of all time and was comfortably among the finest forwards of his generation. Happy to deputise as either a second striker or as a left winger, Henson was a large man with an incredible football brain. Though he was brilliant on the ball and lethal with either foot, it was his arrivals into the box, extraordinary jumping ability and precise bullet headers that made the Great Dane so distinctive. He scored 124 goals in 187 games for Juventus, and maintained a similar record wherever he went. Henson shot to fame with the Danish national team at the Olympic Games in 1948, where he was the top scorer, but the tournament would also mark the end of his international career, aged only 24. Henson scored 4 goals for Denmark in a single game against Italy in the quarter-finals, thus prompting interest from Juventus. However, Danish football was exclusively amateur at the time, and the national team only allowed for amateurs to represent them. That meant that as soon as Henson signed for Juventus, he could no longer represent Denmark, ending his international career prematurely with 10 goals from 8 caps. Henson wasn't the only one. Over half of that Denmark squad from the 1948 Olympics turned professional overseas following the tournament, mostly in Italy, and a handful alongside Henson at Juventus. The same is true for a number of other Nordic players at the time, though Henson features given that he was so talented, he turned professional so young, and he never got the chance to represent Denmark again. HECTOR RIAL. My first thought for this 7, long-term subscribers won't be surprised to discover, was Neil Franklin. For those of you who don't know, Franklin is one of the greatest centre-halves of all time, who revolutionised the English game and the position in many respects, before accepting a lucrative but ultimately ill-fated contract from Independiente Santa Fe, without which he likely would have become the first Englishman, and indeed the first footballer, to reach 100 caps. Instead, he won just 27. The reason he was my first thought is because I've written a book about him, but given that he will be very familiar with regular viewers, and in order to keep things interesting, I thought I'd go for someone else from the El Dorado era of Colombian football instead. HECTOR RIAL is a man whose name doesn't really resonate with many people these days, even in the cities of Buenos Aires and Madrid, with which he is best associated. That does him a disservice though, since Real was without doubt one of the most gifted South American footballers of the 1950s. Considered by many of his generation to be Argentina's second star, trailing only Alfredo Di Stefano. Real and Di Stefano were rivals in Bogotá as Argentine exiles, where they were the star men for Independiente and Millonarios respectively, but when Colombia's house of cards came crashing down, they became teammates at Real Madrid, winning 5 European Cups together. Real left Argentina at the age of only 20, meaning he never won a cap for La Albiceleste, and he only ever won 5 caps for Spain whilst playing for Real Madrid, a derisory figure for a man of his talent. Jimmy McGrory. A legend of the Scottish game, no British footballer has ever scored more top-flight goals than Jimmy McGrory, who bagged a staggering 408 goals in 408 games in the league and 538 goals in 534 games in all competitions. Like many great centre-forwards of his generation, McGrory was renowned for his aerial prowess, but what set the Scot apart from many of his peers was his size. The Glaswegian marksman was just 5'6", yet he could leap higher than almost anyone else, and his movement in the 6-yard box saw him average better than a goal a game over the course of his entire career. To look at McGrory's record at Celtic, where he spent virtually his entire career, you might think he would be a bona fide legend of the Scotland national team. Well, the fact he features in this 7 probably indicates that, despite that initial impression, that isn't the case. Britain's most prolific goalscorer only ever won 7 caps for Scotland, routinely overlooked, typically for Newcastle United legend Hughie Gallagher. McGrory's international debut against Ireland came following an injury to Gallagher in 1928. Scotland lost, McGrory was scapegoated, and he wouldn't win another cap for 3 years. In his 6 future caps, McGrory scored 6 goals, but he only ever played when Gallagher was suspended. Celtic fans often felt that their players were overlooked throughout this period, and McGrory's lack of games is quite shocking. Though, it must be said, Hughie Gallagher was a magnificent centre-forward in his own right, and he did score 24 goals from 20 caps for Scotland. Jair da Costa. Though I have wanted to make this video for a while, it was whilst rereading Jair da Costa's struggles on the international stage that I decided to finally do it. The history of football is littered with great players who didn't win as many caps as they ordinarily would have done due to a certain individual or group of players who played in their position at the same time. Goalkeepers are the most obvious example, like the late great Peter Bonetti, who won only 7 caps as Gordon Banks' deputy, but it can happen all over the pitch. In the case of Jair da Costa, he had the misfortune of competing against not 1, but 2 of the greatest right wingers of all time for a starting berth for Brazil. In the first half of his career, Jair was up against Garrincha, probably the greatest out-and-out right winger of all time. For the second half of his career, he was up against Jairzinho, who scored in every game for Brazil at the 1970 World Cup. Garrincha won 50 caps for Brazil, whilst Jairzinho won 81. Jair only won 1. It's a miserable tally for a far from miserable footballer, who played a key role in turning Inter Milan into powerhouses of not just the Italian, but also the European game. A rapid right-sided forward with fantastic attacking movement, Jair added a sprinkling of magic to Helenio Herrera's disciplined side. His only cap for Brazil came against Wales in 1962, though he was also a non-playing member of Brazil's 1962 World Cup winning squad. Bernabé Ferreira. The man who coined the expression, "I prefer to retire from football before football retires from me," Bernabé Ferreira is a legend of the Argentine game. Nicknamed La Fiera, meaning the Beast, Ferreira was renowned for the strength and aggression that he brought to the role of centre forward with devastating effect. The only man to have averaged better than a goal a game in the entire history of Argentina's top flight, Ferreira scored 45 goals in 43 games for Tigre and 187 goals in 185 games for River Plate, where he retired at the age of 30. As a boy, Ferreira would practice striking the ball for hours on end as he tried to maximise the amount of power that he could put on the ball whilst maintaining his accuracy. His right foot would come to be known as one of the most powerful and lethal in the history of the sport. When Ferreira left Tigre to join River Plate, he set a world record fee unlike any other. Not only did the fee River paid more than double the previous record, the record itself stood for the next 17 years, by far the longest anyone has ever held that title for. For all his qualities, as a player and as a man, Ferreira was adored in Argentina. He was perennially overlooked by Argentina's international selectors. He made his international debut against Uruguay, but was criticised for his performance, and despite his extraordinary goal-scoring record at club level, he failed to score a single goal for the national team. He won just 3 more caps over the next 7 years, overlooked, in favour of the likes of Hermino Masantonio, who, admittedly, did score a pretty impressive 19 goals from 21 caps for Argentina. So that is it for today's video, but thank you all as ever for watching. Give us a like if you enjoyed the video, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram, should you wish to do so, via the username @HITC Sevens on both platforms.